You think you know brutality. You've heard about Viking raids, Roman gladiators, and medieval torture. But what if I told you that none of them, not even close, prepared you for the nightmare that unfolded inside Mongol camps? The empire that once stretched from the Pacific to the heart of Europe wasn't just built on horseback charges and flaming arrows. Behind the thunder of hoofs, behind the walls of their sprawling war camps, another story was unfolding, one written in human misery. Today, we're diving into the side of Mongol history you won't find in blockbuster movies. Forget the romanticized image of fearless warriors. We're talking about the reality faced by slaves, conquered peoples, captured soldiers, and women dragged from villages, forced to endure acts so horrifying that even Mongol chroniclers, who had no problem bragging about massacres, sometimes refused to write down the details. So, buckle up. This isn't Genghis, the visionary strategist. This is Genghis, the architect of nightmares. You think you've seen cruelty in warfare. Burning villages, mass executions, the standard horrors of conquest. But the Mongols perfected something even more terrifying, turning human beings into literal weapons against their own people. Forget swords, forget siege engines, their most devastating tool, the bodies of the enslaved. When the Mongols laid siege to a city, they didn't just surround it with cavalry and wait. They lined up their slaves, captured villagers, prisoners of war, even women and children, and drove them forward as living walls of flesh. Imagine being chained shoulder to shoulder, marched directly toward the fortress your family is hiding inside, knowing the arrows from the walls are about to shred you apart. And here's the horrifying twist. Those arrows are coming from your own people, who must now decide whether to shoot their friends and neighbors or lower their bows and watch the Mongols break through. Persian historian Juvayni, writing about the fall of Nishapur in 1221, describes how thousands of captives were pushed in front of the Mongol army. The defenders fired anyway, killing hundreds of their own kin, because if they didn't, the Mongols would have stormed the walls within hours. This wasn't random brutality. This was psychological warfare so effective it broke entire cities before a single Mongol arrow was loosed. Think about the mechanics here. The Mongols weren't improvising. They had a system. Prisoners captured from one city became the shield for the next. By the time the army reached the great Khwarezmian cities like Bukhara and Samarkand, they had perfected the process. The advance wave was nothing but terrified peasants chained together, prodded forward by Mongol lances. If they survived the arrows, they were forced to fill in moats, drag siege equipment, or build earthen ramps under fire. And when the work was done, they were discarded, often executed en masse, their corpses thrown into pits so the Mongols didn't have to feed them. One chilling account from the siege of Bamiyan tells of prisoners used to carry ladders and scaling ropes to the fortress walls. The Mongols drove them forward at spear point, knowing they would be the first cut down by defenders. Those who faltered were cut down immediately, not by arrows from the city, but by Mongol sabers from behind. Survival wasn't the goal. The goal was terror. Here's what most people don't realize. This wasn't just cruelty for cruelty's sake. It was logistical genius. By forcing slaves to take the brunt of the defenders' firepower, the Mongols preserved their own elite warriors. Why waste precious mounted archers when you can throw expendable human lives at the walls? Even more insidiously, it shattered morale. Defenders who saw their loved ones being driven toward them as shields lost the will to fight. Contemporary sources tell of entire garrisons surrendering rather than face the unbearable choice of killing their own kin. Let me tell you about one such case. During the campaign against the Khwarezmian fortress of Urgench, Mongols gathered thousands of captured civilians from the surrounding countryside. Families were split deliberately. Fathers forced to march on walls, while mothers and children were chained in the rear, screaming their names. Defenders on the walls recognized neighbors, cousins, even siblings among the captives being whipped forward. Chroniclers record that archers lowered their bows, unable to fire. The hesitation was all the Mongols needed. Within days, Urgench fell. And when it did, the same captives who had been used as shields were slaughtered along with the defenders. No one was spared. Think about the psychological damage of this system. Imagine being a mother on the walls, watching your son forced to carry ladders toward the enemy. Do you shoot him to protect the city? Or do you hold your fire and let the Mongols breach the gates? This was warfare weaponized not just against armies, but against the very bonds of human love. And it worked with horrifying efficiency. The genius, if you can call it that, was in how sustainable the system was. Every victory created more slaves, and every slave became a tool for the next conquest. It was a conveyor belt of suffering, a cycle of capture, coercion, and disposal that fueled the Mongol war machine across continents. By the time the empire stretched from China to Eastern Europe, millions had been caught in this revolving door of terror. Archaeological evidence backs this up. Mass graves outside Mongol siege sites contain mixed remains, men, women, and children buried hastily, many showing signs of blunt trauma rather than battle wounds. These weren't soldiers who died with weapons in hand. They were expendables, driven to the front, slaughtered, and dumped. Here's the most disturbing part. Even the Mongols themselves, a people who casually bragged about pyramids of skulls and rivers of blood, rarely boasted about using human shields. They bragged about massacres. They bragged about burning cities. But in their chronicles, when it comes to this practice, silence often falls. It was as if even they understood this crossed some invisible line that using slaves as weapons against their own families was a cruelty too dark even for the world's most notorious conquerors. But silence doesn't erase memory. The Persian and Arab chroniclers who watched it happen wrote it down, sometimes with shaking hands. Their words remind us that for the Mongols, a slave wasn't even a person. He was a tool, a disposable arrow, a body to be stacked like wood. And when that body was no longer useful, it was discarded without a thought. This was chapter 1 in the Mongol nightmare. Slaves turned into weapons, love weaponized into terror, families forced to watch each other die. A horror so complete that even centuries later, the ground at Nishapur and Samarkand still whispers with the bones of those who were marched to their deaths not because of what they did, but because they were unlucky enough to live in the path of an empire that saw human life as just another piece of ammunition. When you imagine the Mongols on campaign, you probably picture endless herds of horses, rivers of milk from mares, and wagons piled with dried meat. That's the Hollywood version, the myth of an unstoppable army with endless supplies. The truth is darker and far more grotesque. Because when rations ran low in those sprawling camps, when even the steppe ponies grew thin, the first to pay the price weren't the warriors. They were the slaves. The Mongols traveled light and fast. They had no massive supply trains like European armies. Instead, they lived off the land and, more often, off the people they conquered. When they stormed the city, survivors weren't just shackled and driven as labor, they became a walking larder. Chroniclers describe captives dragged along on campaign not to be fed, but to be consumed, literally. One Persian account from the Khwarezmian campaign's records that when food grew scarce in the deserts, Mongol warriors simply slaughtered their slaves for meat. Some were cooked, others left as carrion for the dogs. To the Mongols, human bodies were a resource no different than cattle or sheep. The chilling part is how casually this is mentioned in the sources, like noting the weather or the cost of grain. To them, it wasn't atrocity. It was logistics. Here's what most people don't realize. The Mongols carried dried curd, fermented mare's milk, and strips of dried meat as rations. But an army of hundreds of thousands moving through scorched earth couldn't always count on forage. Once the cattle were gone and the horses too weak, the expendables, the slaves, became the emergency supply chain. A human life was cheaper than a sheep. Why waste precious livestock when you had thousands of captives? Let me tell you about Nishapur, 1221. After the city fell, over 100,000 people were reported killed. But not all died in the massacre. Many survivors were chained and forced to march with the army. Rashid al-Din, the great Persian historian, tells us that when famine struck in the Mongol camp, some of those very captives were butchered alive. Bodies roasted over open flames, flesh stripped from bone, while others, terrified, starving themselves, watched and waited for their turn. Imagine the psychological torment. You're already a slave, already doomed. And now, the people who hold your chains see you not as human, but as tomorrow's dinner. This wasn't isolated. Russian chronicles tell similar stories during the Mongol invasion of the steppe principalities. At the siege of Kozalsk in 1238, survivors describe cartloads of prisoners taken not back to Mongolia, but directly into Mongol kitchens. Some were skinned, others dismembered, the parts rationed to warriors like cuts of venison. The Mongols weren't squeamish. Hunger stripped away whatever thin line remained between cruelty and necessity. But here's the twisted genius. They didn't just use flesh for food. Slaves too weak to march were slaughtered and their corpses thrown into rivers to pollute water supplies for the enemy. Others were stacked in heaps to rot, the stench spreading terror to nearby villages. In some cases, Mongols deliberately left half-burned corpses visible along roads, sending a clear message: resist, and this is your fate not only in life, but in death. One chilling story comes from the campaign in northern China against the Jin dynasty. Chinese sources report that during a long siege, Mongols ran dangerously low on supplies. Rather than retreat, they turned inward, feasting on their slaves. Archaeological digs at siege sites confirm mass graves with butcher marks on human bones, clean cuts at joints, skulls cracked as if for marrow. This isn't myth. This is science catching up with the chronicles. The horror wasn't only in the killing, it was in the waiting. Slaves weren't told when or if they'd be eaten. They were forced to carry provisions, cook meals, serve warriors, all while knowing the moment food ran short, their bodies might be next on the spit. Imagine the terror at night, lying awake, hearing a comrade's screams as he was dragged away. Imagine the smell of roasting flesh drifting through the camp, knowing it belonged to someone who had been alive that morning. And here's a detail that will make your stomach turn. Mongol warriors sometimes justified this practice with grim humor. Sources mention soldiers joking that human meat was tougher than horse, but it kept you alive long enough to win another battle. The casualness is the true horror, not rage, not frenzy, but cold practicality. Even more disturbing, some slaves were forced to participate in the butchery of their fellows. Accounts speak of prisoners ordered to cut apart the bodies of friends, neighbors, or even family. Refusal meant instant death. Obedience meant survival for another day. This was psychological torture as much as it was sustenance. The Mongols broke spirits by making the enslaved complicit in their own destruction. Let's pause here. Why don't we hear about this in school? Because cannibalism, especially state-sanctioned cannibalism, doesn't fit the tidy narrative of Genghis Khan as a brilliant conqueror. Textbooks celebrate his postal system, his trade routes, his religious tolerance. They rarely mention the nights when slaves boiled in cauldrons so warriors could fight another day. But the sources are there, written in Persian, Arabic, Russian, and Chinese. They tell a story we've chosen to forget. And remember, this wasn't every day, every camp. The Mongols weren't cartoon monsters who preferred human flesh over beef. But when desperation came, when famine struck, the expendable were consumed. And the expendable were always the slaves. So the next time someone describes the Mongol horde as a well-oiled war machine, remember what fueled it. Not just horses and fermented milk, but human flesh, the bodies of captives dragged from their homes, stripped of their dignity, and finally stripped of their skin. This was the second horror of the Mongol slave camps. Not just slavery, not just death, but the knowledge that your captors saw you as nothing more than meat, a resource to be used, consumed, and discarded. And if you think it couldn't get worse, just wait until you learn how those same slaves were used for entertainment games of cruelty designed not to feed hunger, but to feed the Mongol appetite for fear. Warriors everywhere throughout history have had their entertainments. Romans had gladiators. Medieval Europeans had jousts. Even the Vikings had wrestling matches and drinking contests. But the Mongols? Their games were something else entirely. Because when you live in a world where conquest is your profession, and cruelty your currency, you don't pass the time with chess or dice. You invent games played with human lives. Inside Mongol slave camps, cruelty wasn't just a byproduct of boredom. It was a performance, a spectacle, a way of reinforcing dominance. Slaves weren't just workers or chattel. They were toys, disposable pawns in games designed not only to amuse warriors but to harden them, to make killing feel like sport. One of the most notorious amusements was the hunt. Chronicles by Rashid al-Din and later Persian historians describe how groups of slaves, sometimes dozens, sometimes hundreds, were tied together and driven into the open steppe. The Mongols mounted their horses, circled them, and began shooting arrows, not to kill quickly, but to wound, to prolong. The goal wasn't victory. The goal was entertainment. Warriors would compete over who could hit the most targets without killing them outright, leaving the unfortunate captives crawling, bleeding, screaming on the ground. At the end, the survivors were often trampled under horses, crushed into the earth like insects. And here's the twisted part. The Mongols didn't hide these games. They celebrated them. The same way a medieval lord might sponsor a joust, Mongol commanders turned cruelty into a form of festival. Wine flowed, songs were sung, and somewhere in the middle of it all, dozens of broken slaves gasped out their final breaths, sacrificed to the steppe gods of entertainment. But hunting wasn't the only game. Some sources describe contests where slaves were forced to fight each other barehanded, armed with sticks, or occasionally with knives. Think gladiatorial combat stripped of all pretense of glory. Victors weren't crowned with laurels or freedom. They were sometimes allowed to live another week. Losers? Their bodies became fodder for the camp dogs. The Mongols weren't raising champions. They were feeding bloodlust. One chilling account comes from a Russian chronicle after the fall of Ryazan in 1237. Survivors describe a tournament where Mongols forced captured men to run in circles while mounted archers aimed at them like living targets. The twist? Warriors won prestige for shooting off body parts, an ear, a hand, even a nose, without killing outright. Imagine the screams, the blood spraying in arcs, while the camp roared with laughter. These weren't games of skill. They were rehearsals for cruelty. Here's what most people don't realize. This wasn't random sadism. It was a system. By turning human suffering into a sport, the Mongols desensitized their warriors. Killing became a casual skill, honed not just in battle but in play. When you've spent your evenings treating people like target practice, slaughtering entire cities, the next morning doesn't weigh on your conscience. It becomes second nature. Let me tell you about another game won that makes even hardened historians wince. Some captives were tied to stakes, and Mongol archers would test their accuracy by firing arrows as close as possible without hitting vital organs. A slip of the hand, a tremor in the bowstring, and the captive was dead. But often, that was the point. The game wasn't about sparing lives. It was about demonstrating skill while proving that the captive's body meant nothing. Your heart wasn't racing because you might kill a man. It was racing because you were showing off for your comrades. And the cruelty didn't stop with men. Women were dragged into these spectacles too. Some were stripped and chased across fields, warriors betting on who could catch them first. Others were forced into degrading performances, mocked and humiliated before being executed. The Mongols knew humiliation was as powerful a weapon as death. By breaking their captives publicly, they broke entire communities psychologically. Archaeological evidence again supports the chronicles. Mass graves at certain Mongol siege sites reveal skeletons with unusual injuries, broken bones that healed poorly, arrow wounds in extremities rather than vital areas. These weren't soldiers who fell in combat. These were victims of games, wounded for amusement before being discarded. Now, here's the disturbing part that connects it all. Steppe culture had long traditions of hunting games, where herds of animals were driven into traps for warriors to practice their archery. The Mongols simply replaced animals with people. What had once been training for survival became training for domination. And once you cross that line, once you start treating human beings as prey, the step from hunting deer to hunting men is terrifyingly small. One Persian source recounts a particularly grotesque spectacle held by Mongke Khan. Hundreds of prisoners were released onto the steppe in stages, while mounted warriors rode them down one by one. Some were skewered with lances, others shot with arrows, others decapitated with sabers. The Khan himself sat drinking, laughing, awarding prizes to the most creative kills. Think about that. The ruler of the largest empire the world had ever seen, applauding like a spectator at a circus, while human lives were extinguished for sport. And what about the survivors? Few survived long. Those who did were often mutilated, ears cut off, noses sliced, fingers severed before being released as living warnings. Imagine being sent back to your city with your face carved away, told to tell your people what the Mongols did in their camps. That wasn't just cruelty. That was psychological warfare, weaponized through play. Let's not romanticize this. History textbooks like to paint the Mongols as ruthless but pragmatic, masters of strategy who built trade routes and enforced stability. But cruelty wasn't just a byproduct of conquest. It was a form of entertainment, woven into the very fabric of their camps. Slaves weren't just tools for labor. They were toys for death matches, trophies for archery contests, and targets for hunting games. And if you think this sounds like exaggeration, remember the words of Giovanni da Pian del Carpin, one of the earliest European envoys to the Mongol court. He wrote that the Mongols delight in watching men die, not in war, not in justice, but in sport. That's not the testimony of an enemy exaggerating atrocities. That's the observation of a man who saw it with his own eyes. So the next time you hear someone say the Mongols were ahead of their time in strategy and empire building, remember this chapter. Remember the fields littered with bleeding captives, the laughter of mounted warriors, the contests where human bodies were reduced to targets. For the Mongols, cruelty wasn't just a tool of conquest. It was a game. And in those games, the slaves of the camp were always the pieces sacrificed first. When people talk about the Mongols, they love to mention religious tolerance, trade networks, and cultural exchange. What they don't like to mention is what happened to the women who ended up in Mongol slave camps. Because for the empire of Genghis Khan, women weren't just spoils of war. They were breeding stock. Let's be clear here. The Mongols didn't just abduct women for sexual pleasure. They turned reproduction into a weapon. Every raid, every siege, every massacre produced thousands of captives. And among them, women were singled out for a very specific fate. They were forced into what we might call today breeding pits, mass systems of sexual enslavement designed to both satisfy Mongol soldiers and to produce children who would be raised not as free people, but as expendables in the machinery of empire. Persian historian Giovanni, who witnessed the Mongol conquest firsthand, makes chilling references to this practice. He describes how entire populations of women were divided among the troops after cities fell. They weren't given homes, security, or even consistent owners. They were herded into crude camp enclosures, watched by guards, and raped systematically. Some bore children who were immediately taken away, raised as slaves or servants. Others were discarded once they became pregnant, their usefulness spent. Here's what most people don't realize. This wasn't random brutality. It was calculated policy. Genghis Khan himself had more wives and concubines than most emperors could dream of. Scholars estimate he fathered hundreds of children. His genetic legacy so vast that today, about 1 in 200 men on Earth carries his Y chromosome. That's not legend, that's population genetics. But the terrifying part is this. What Genghis practiced on an imperial scale, his soldiers practiced in miniature. Each victory was an opportunity to reproduce, not just for pleasure, but to spread Mongol bloodlines while erasing those of the conquered. In the camps themselves, archaeological digs near Karakorum and other Mongol centers reveal clusters of female skeletons, many between the ages of 12 and 25. The demographic profile is chilling. Prime reproductive age, many showing signs of malnutrition, repeated childbirth, and in some cases, violent death. These weren't noble women living as consorts. These were captives cycled through the system until their bodies broke. Let me tell you about Nishapur again. After the massacre of 1221, thousands of women were taken as captives. Contemporary sources describe how they were sorted like livestock. Young, healthy women were handed to officers. Older women, or those deemed less desirable, were forced into communal brothels within the Mongol camps. These weren't brothels in the modern sense, they were rape centers, places where dozens of men used the same women nightly. The goal wasn't intimacy, it was humiliation, domination, and reproduction. Chinese sources during the Mongol conquest of the Jin dynasty echo the same horror. Women were herded into compounds guarded day and night, with soldiers cycling through them like customers at a market stall. Survivors describe women so broken by repeated assaults that they could no longer stand. Some took their own lives. Others were killed by guards when they resisted. Children born of these women were often enslaved immediately, stripped from their mothers and raised to serve in the very camps where their mothers remained prisoners. Here's where it gets even darker. The Mongols had a brutal sense of hierarchy in the system. Women of noble birth princesses, daughters of governors, wives of generals were sometimes taken into the harems of Mongol princes, their status preserved only to the extent that they entertained their captors. But common women? They were seen as interchangeable, disposable. When their bodies were no longer useful, they were cast aside. Sometimes that meant being sold to other slave markets. Sometimes it meant being executed en masse to prevent them from becoming a burden on the camp. Let me paint one specific scene. A Persian chronicler describes how, after the fall of Merv, Mongol soldiers gathered hundreds of women in a large tent. Men lined up outside, entering in groups. The women screamed, cried, begged. Some fainted from terror. By the end of the night, dozens were dead from suffocation, assault, or sheer exhaustion. Their bodies were dragged out and replaced by more captives the next day. This wasn't hidden. It wasn't a shame. It was normalized. And here's the psychological warfare element. By enslaving women on this scale, the Mongols weren't just satisfying themselves. They were breaking entire communities. Imagine being a surviving father or brother, forced to watch your daughter or sister carried off into a breeding pit. Imagine knowing that if she bore children, they would belong to your enemy, that her womb itself had become a weapon against your people. This was cultural annihilation by biology. Modern historians point out that one of the reasons Mongol genetic signatures are so widespread today is precisely because of this system. It wasn't just Genghis Khan's personal conquests. It was the systematic use of enslaved women to expand Mongol bloodlines across Eurasia. This wasn't an accident of history. It was a deliberate policy of domination. And here's the kicker. Women weren't always treated as permanent captives. Sometimes, once they were used up, they were discarded like broken tools. Accounts tell of women drowned in rivers, executed in pits, or left to starve once they could no longer produce or please. In some sieges, women were slaughtered en masse after serving their purpose, their corpses thrown onto burning pyres alongside the men of their city. Even the Mongol elite acknowledged the horror. Friar Giovanni d'Appian del Carpien, one of the first European envoys to the Mongol court, reported seeing tents filled with women, none free to refuse, none free to rest. He wrote of young girls barely past puberty, dragged from their families and forced into sexual servitude. He described the despair in their faces, the emptiness in their eyes, and the chilling indifference of their captors. So what does this all mean? It means the Mongol Empire wasn't just built on the destruction of cities and the massacre of men. It was built on the systematic violation of women, turned into a factory of forced reproduction and humiliation. The breeding pits weren't footnotes, they were central to the Mongol war machine. And yet, here's the most disturbing part. The children born of these horrors often grew up never knowing their mothers, never knowing freedom. They were raised as slaves, soldiers, or servants, loyal not to the people who birthed them, but to the empire that enslaved them. The cycle of cruelty became self-sustaining. Women produced children, children became servants, servants supported the empire, and the empire captured more women. This was chapter 4 of The Mongol Nightmare, the breeding pits. Not just rape, not just humiliation, but the industrial-scale weaponization of women's bodies, their wombs turned into battlefields, their children transformed into instruments of the very empire that destroyed their families. It wasn't war. It wasn't lust. It was policy. When you hear the name Karakorum, you probably imagine a glittering capital, trade caravans from Persia and China unloading their goods, envoys from Europe kneeling before the Great Khan, golden palaces rising in the middle of the steppe. That's the tourist brochure version, the image polished by chronicles, eager to impress the world with the splendor of the Mongol Empire. But step behind the facades of those palaces, into the smoke-choked outskirts of the city, and you find a very different Karakorum. Because for the thousands of slaves dragged into its streets, Karakorum wasn't the center of civilization. It was a furnace of misery, a place where human bodies were worked to ash, sometimes literally. The Mongols built their empire fast. Cities don't rise from grassland without hands to lift the stone, to forge the beams, to feed the garrisons. But the Mongols weren't stonemasons or farmers. They were conquerors. The solution was obvious. Enslave the conquered to build the capital. And so from China, from Khwarezm, from the shattered cities of Persia, wave after wave of captives were marched across deserts and mountains into the heart of Mongolia. Those who survived the journey found themselves in Karakorum, a city built on their backs and water with their blood. Here's what most people don't realize. Karakorum wasn't just a political capital. It was also a slave city. For every nobleman riding through its broad avenues, for every merchant trading silks and spices in its markets, there were hundreds of slaves digging foundations, cooking meals, tanning hides, repairing saddles, grinding grain, and cleaning refuse. They lived in tents or mud huts on the fringes of the city. Their lives measured in hours of labor and in beatings survived. And when they faltered, that's when the fires came. Persian sources record that slaves who slowed in their work, who grew too weak from hunger, or who simply collapsed in the dust, were often thrown into the refuse pits at the edge of the city. These weren't just garbage dumps. They were incinerators. Piles of animal bones, broken tools, and human bodies burned together in heaps that smoked for days. The screams of the dying mixed with the crackle of flames, a grim soundtrack for the city rising in splendor nearby. Archaeological excavations around Karakorum have uncovered blackened soil filled with human bone fragments, some bearing scorch marks consistent with burning at high heat. These weren't funeral pyres. These were disposal pits. Slaves who had outlived their usefulness weren't buried. They were fuel. Ash blown across the steppe carried the particles of human bodies, invisible reminders that the great Mongol capital was literally built on the cremated remains of its captives. But the fire wasn't always punishment. Sometimes it was spectacle. Rashid al-Din recounts that Mongol commanders staged public burnings of slaves as warnings. Captives accused of theft, sabotage, or even insolence were tied together and set alight before the assembled camp. The message was clear. Disobedience is ash. Imagine the terror of other slaves watching men and women screaming, writhing, the smell of burning flesh filling their nostrils as Mongol warriors roared with laughter. And here's the twisted part. These weren't isolated incidents. They were ritualized. Fire had a sacred dimension in Mongol shamanic belief. It was purification, destruction, transformation. By burning slaves alive, the Mongols weren't just disposing of bodies. They were enacting a symbolic ritual of dominance, turning enemies into smoke that vanished into the sky. To the victims, it was agony. To the Mongols, it was theater. One account from the Yuan Dynasty Chronicles describes a grim practice. Slaves forced to cremate each other. Captives would be ordered to pile wood, drag the condemned to the pit, and light the fire. Refuse, broken carts, animal dung, whatever fuel could be found, was stacked around the living bodies. Those who refused were beaten or thrown in themselves. This psychological cruelty ensured complicity. You became the executioner of your fellow captives, knowing the same fate awaited you when you grew weak. Let me give you one specific case. In 1251, during the reign of Mengke Khan, Chinese artisans captured from the Song dynasty were brought to Karakorum to build monumental walls. When several of them collapsed from exhaustion, guards dragged them into a pit, piled reeds over their bodies, and set them on fire. The others, horrified, tried to hide their weakness. Some mutilated themselves, deliberately cutting fingers or feigning illness in hopes of being discarded rather than burned. But the Mongols had no mercy. Burned corpses didn't demand food. They didn't rebel. They didn't slow the construction of the Khan's palace. Here's what's most disturbing. Even foreign envoys noticed the smoke. Friar William of Rubruck, the Flemish missionary who visited Karakorum in the 1250 seconds, wrote of the thick stench around the city and the heaps of ash where men and animals had been thrown together. He didn't dwell on it, perhaps out of caution, perhaps out of revulsion, but the hint is there. The grandeur of the capital masked a horror no envoy dared describe in full. And it wasn't just in Karakorum. As the Mongol Empire expanded, every major encampment had its refuse pits, its fire pits, its places of disposal. Slaves weren't executed with pomp or trial. They were burned like garbage. The fire consumed not only their bodies, but their identities, leaving nothing but smoke and silence. Think about what that does to a culture. Entire populations were erased, their voices gone, their bones charred beyond recognition. Unlike the skull pyramids Mongols built as trophies after massacres, physical reminders of their power, the fires left nothing but ash. No trace, no monument, no chance of remembrance. It was annihilation perfected, efficient, total, unmemorable. So when you imagine Karakoram, don't see only the palaces, the bustling markets, the envoys bringing gifts from Baghdad, Paris, and Beijing. See also the outskirts, where pits of flame devoured the bodies of slaves. See the smoke rising into the Mongolian sky, carrying with it the last screams of men and women whose only crime was to collapse under impossible labor. This was chapter 5 of the Mongol nightmare, the fires of Karakoram, a capital city built not just with slave labor, but with slave ash, where collapse meant cremation, and fire was both punishment and policy. A place where empire shone in the daylight, but at night the wind carried the smell of burning flesh across the steppe. If you think Mongol cruelty was all about swords, arrows, and fire, you're only seeing half the picture. The Mongols didn't just destroy bodies, they broke minds. For them, pain wasn't always about blood. Sometimes, the slowest, most effective weapon was humiliation. And inside the slave camps, psychological torture became both a pastime and a policy. We tend to imagine torture as something hidden, confined to dungeons or interrogation rooms. But for the Mongols, it was often public, staged as entertainment for the warriors, a grim reminder for the slaves. And what's most disturbing, this entertainment wasn't always physical mutilation. Sometimes it was games of humiliation, degradation so complete that it hollowed out a person's soul before the blade ever touched their throat. One Mongol game involved forcing slaves to crawl on their hands and knees through the filth of the camp mud, dung, rotting carcasses, while warriors jeered, spat, and whipped them forward. Some were made to bark like dogs, bray like donkeys, or neigh like horses, while their masters roared with laughter. Imagine the sight, a line of once proud men, stripped of clothes and dignity, crawling and barking, while an army of conquerors drank and mocked them. That wasn't punishment. That was theater. Here's what most people don't realize. Humiliation wasn't random cruelty. It was weaponized psychology. By forcing slaves to perform animal-like behavior, the Mongols erased their humanity, not just in the eyes of the warriors, but in the slaves' own minds. Once you've crawled on all fours, once you've been forced to howl for scraps of food like a dog, it becomes easier to accept that you are no longer human. And once you accept that, resistance dies before it even begins. But humiliation didn't stop there. Some accounts describe slaves forced to fight each other not to the death, but until one was beaten unconscious. The victor was rewarded with scraps of food or a temporary reprieve from labor. The loser, dragged away and often executed. Imagine the horror of being forced to bludgeon your friend or brother just to survive one more day. The Mongols didn't have to lift a hand. They turned survival into betrayal, laughter into a weapon sharper than any sword. Let me tell you about one specific incident recorded by Persian chroniclers. During a feast following the fall of a Khwarezmian city, Mongol officers gathered dozens of captives in a circle. They ordered the men to dance, singing songs in languages the Mongols didn't understand. When the captives faltered, confused, or ashamed, they were beaten with whips until their voices cracked and their feet bled. Some collapsed. The officers laughed harder, pelting them with food scraps like animals in a circus. And when the feast ended, the dancers were executed not because they resisted, but because their humiliation had already served its purpose. The cruel genius here was repetition. These weren't one-time spectacles. They happened daily, a constant erosion of dignity. Slaves never knew when humiliation would strike during a meal, during labor, even the dead of night. Guards would burst into tents, ordering captives to strip, to crawl, to sing, to fight. The unpredictability itself was torture. Living in a state of permanent fear, where every moment might become a stage for mockery, broke spirits faster than whips, Even women weren't spared. In Mongol camps, female captives were sometimes forced into degrading rituals, mock weddings, where multiple men married a single woman in front of the crowd, humiliating songs sung about their bride price, before being dragged into tents for systematic rape. It wasn't just about physical violation. It was about breaking the spirit so thoroughly that even the memory of dignity became impossible. And here's the detail that will make your skin crawl. Sometimes slaves weren't even the direct victims of the games. They were made to watch. The Mongols knew that witnessing humiliation could be as damaging as suffering it yourself. Fathers forced to watch their daughters mocked, sons forced to watch their mothers stripped, friends forced to watch each other beaten to pulp. The helplessness, the inability to act, was its own form of torture. Psychological cruelty also had a strategic function. By breaking captives in camp, the Mongols ensured that word spread back to besieged cities. Survivors, those deliberately released or those who escaped, told stories not just of slaughter but of humiliation so profound it made death seem merciful. Imagine being a villager hearing that those captured weren't just killed but made to bark, crawl, and eat filth. That kind of terror corrodes the will to resist before the first arrow flies. And yet, what's perhaps most disturbing is how normalized this became. Chroniclers like Giovanni d'Appian del Carpin and William of Rubruck, European envoys who saw Mongol camps firsthand, remarked on the casualness of it all. Warriors would laugh at humiliation the way we might laugh at a joke. A man forced to bray like a donkey wasn't a tragedy, he was entertainment. A beaten captive wasn't cruelty, he was sport. Let's pause on that for a moment. Imagine being a slave in those camps. Every morning you wake knowing that today you might be forced to act like an animal, that today you might be made to fight your friend, to sing until your voice breaks, to crawl through filth under the whip. And even if you survive, the laughter of your captors stays in your ears, echoing louder than any scream. That's not survival. That's slow death of the soul. Historians often ask, how did the Mongols control populations so vast, stretching from China to Eastern Europe, with armies that were relatively small? The answer lies partly here. They didn't just conquer bodies, they conquered minds. Humiliation was as effective as massacre. A population that sees itself as less than human is a population that won't rise up. This was chapter 6 of the Mongol Nightmare. Psychological torture as entertainment, where cruelty wasn't hidden in dungeons, but performed under open sky, where laughter replaced mercy, where humiliation replaced punishment, and where the breaking of the human spirit became as routine as sharpening a sword. The Mongols didn't just kill, they choreographed death, and nowhere is that clearer than in what came after the battles, the way they disposed of human bodies. Because for the Mongols, corpses weren't just refuse. They were messages, weapons of terror, and reminders that defiance would drown entire cities. In some places, those messages took the form of skull pyramids. But in others, the Mongols turned water itself into a grave. They created rivers of corpses. Take the infamous massacre at Nishapur in 1221. Chroniclers estimate that over 100,000 people were slaughtered after the city resisted Mongol rule. The slaughter didn't end when the fighting did. Survivors captured men, women, and slaves were forced to dig massive trenches outside the city walls. Imagine digging, hands blistered, your shovel heavy, knowing that the pit you carve into the earth is the place you will soon be thrown into. Then, once the trenches were ready, the Mongols began the executions. Entire lines of people beheaded or speared, their bodies tumbling into the pits. And when the last victim fell, the Mongols laughed and ordered the next group of slaves to cover the mass grave. In some accounts, rivers nearby turned red as blood seeped into the water, carrying fragments of flesh downstream. The rivers themselves became monuments to death. Here's what most people don't realize. Mass graves weren't just disposal, they were psychological warfare. By forcing slaves to dig the graves of their own families and neighbors, the Mongols turned every moment into torture. Each scoop of dirt was another reminder that your life had no meaning. You weren't just burying corpses, you were burying hope. And when your turn came to join the dead, you fell into a pit you had prepared with your own hands. That's cruelty on a scale beyond imagination. But Nishapur was only one example. At Merv, Chroniclers record that over 700,000 people were killed, an almost unimaginable number. Slaves were made to drag bodies to rivers and dump them in, clogging waterways with human remains. The stench was so overwhelming that nearby villages fled, not because Mongol armies threatened them, but because the very air was unbreathable. Wells and canals turned black with decay. Water that once gave life now spread death, carrying disease and despair into the land. Archaeologists have uncovered sites across Central Asia where layers of silt and bone intermingle, evidence of corpses dumped wholesale into rivers. These weren't burials. These were industrial disposals, thousands of bodies thrown into water until the current could carry no more. Some rivers became so clogged that dams of flesh and bone formed, diverting the flow. Imagine walking along a stream and seeing skulls bobbing in the current, hands sticking out of the mud, the water itself whispering with the memory of slaughter. The Mongols weaponized this imagery deliberately. Rivers were lifelines in Central Asia, sources of drinking water, irrigation, and trade. By filling them with corpses, the Mongols destroyed not just life but survival. Drink from the river, and you drank death. Irrigate your fields, and you poison your crops. The land itself seemed cursed, as if the Mongols had turned nature against you. And in a sense, they had. One Persian chronicler recalls a chilling scene during the siege of Gurgenj, the Khwarezmian capital. After the city fell, tens of thousands of bodies were cast into the Oxus River. The water turned thick with blood, so much so that horses refused to drink from it. Survivors who fled downstream found the banks lined with swollen corpses, eyes staring blankly at the sky. The river, once a source of life for entire civilizations, had become a moving graveyard. And it wasn't just disposal. Sometimes the Mongols staged their executions directly at riversides. Captives were lined up and decapitated, their bodies tossed into the current one after another. Witnesses described the water foaming red, corpses bumping against each other like driftwood. Imagine standing there, chained, waiting your turn, watching bodies float past, knowing in moments you'll join them. That's not just death, that's psychological collapse. Here's a detail to make your stomach turn. In some places, the Mongols deliberately polluted rivers with corpses as a siege tactic. By dumping bodies upstream, they ensured that defenders downstream would be poisoned, sickened, and terrified. It was biological warfare centuries before the term existed. And who carried those bodies? Who heaved them into the water? The slaves. Captives too terrified to resist, forced to poison their own people. Even in death, the Mongols used corpses to divide communities. They sometimes spared a handful of survivors and ordered them to fish bodies out of rivers, to clean the rot, to bury what remained. Imagine hauling the bloated, stinking body of your child from a current, your hands shaking as Mongol guards jeered. That wasn't mercy. That was cruelty stretched into days and weeks, and here's what makes it worse. Unlike pyramids of skulls, which at least left visible monuments to atrocity, rivers carried corpses away. They erased the evidence. Villages downstream would see floating bodies, yes, but the source of the slaughter became diffuse, almost mythic. Survivors told stories of rivers that ran red for days, of waters that stank of the dead. These weren't exaggerations. They were lived nightmares. Let's not romanticize this as a mere barbarism. The Mongols knew exactly what they were doing. They understood the psychological weight of desecrated water. To destroy a city's people was one thing. To destroy its river was to destroy its future. And by making slaves complicit, forcing them to drag the corpses of neighbors, family, even children to the water, they ensured the wound cut deepest. So when you hear about the rivers of Central Asia, about the Amu Darya and Sir Darya, remember that their waters once carried more than fish in trade. They carried human flesh, human despair. Entire cities reduced to currents of corpses. This was chapter 7 of the Mongol Nightmare, the River of Corpses. Not just a massacre, not just a burial, but a deliberate weaponization of water, turning life into death, rivers into graveyards, and memory into terror that still lingers centuries later. When we think of Mongol conquest, we often picture the thunder of hooves, armies moving with terrifying speed across continents. But what we rarely picture are the captives, the slaves dragged in the wake of those armies. For them, the journey wasn't swift or glorious. It was a nightmare of endless horizons, blistered feet, and death scattered like breadcrumbs across the steppe. Because when the Mongols forced people into marches, they weren't moving prisoners. They were moving expendables, and the road itself became a graveyard. The Mongols called their empire the eternal blue sky's will, but for the enslaved, the sky was a curse. Imagine being ripped from your city, chained to strangers, and driven across deserts and mountains with no food, little water, and no hope of return. Some marches lasted weeks, others months. For the Mongols, this was efficient logistics. Move laborers, artisans, and women to the next siege or settlement. For the captives, it was slow-motion extermination. Persian historian Juvayni describes one such forced march after the sack of Merv in 1221. Tens of thousands of survivors, women, children, and old men, among them were herded out of the burning city. The strong were whipped forward, while the weak stumbled and fell. Those who couldn't keep pace were cut down on the spot or left for wolves and scavenging birds. By the time the column reached its destination, barely a fraction remained alive. And yet, the Mongols considered this a success. The dead no longer required food, and the survivors were tempered by hardship, ready for slavery. Here's what most people don't realize. The Mongols didn't see these marches as cruelty. They saw them as filters. The weak perished, the strong survived. And the strong could be put to work, building, farming, or serving. It was social Darwinism centuries before the term existed, weaponized across thousands of miles. Chinese sources during the Jin dynasty's fall echo the same story. Captives driven for weeks through barren terrain, carrying supplies for their captors. At night, they collapsed on the frozen ground, too terrified to sleep deeply lest they be speared for laziness. Mothers carry infants until their arms gave out, then abandon them on the roadside to die. Chroniclers note the silence of those marches. No songs, no chatter, only the sound of feet dragging through dust and the occasional scream when someone collapsed under the lash. And let's not forget the distances involved. The Mongol Empire stretched from the Yellow Sea to the Black Sea. Prisoners from Persia might be marched thousands of kilometers into Mongolia proper. Artisans from China were relocated to Central Asia. Russian captives were dragged south into the steppes. Imagine being taken from your village and marched across landscapes you couldn't even name, knowing you'd never see home again. One particularly horrifying account comes from the Russian chronicles of the Mongol invasion of 1237-1240. Survivors describe columns of captives driven across snowbound fields with no shoes, their feet blackened by frostbite. Children froze in their mothers' arms. Those who stumbled were trampled by horses. Trails of corpses stretched for miles, marking the Mongols' path like grotesque milestones. Wolves followed in packs, feasting on the dead, sometimes dragging away the still breathing. And the marches weren't just about relocation. They were about breaking spirit. The Mongols deliberately starved their captives, rationing food to the bare minimum. Some prisoners resorted to eating grass, roots, even leather straps. In desperate cases, they turned to cannibalism, feeding on the bodies of those who had fallen. Chronicles record this not as exaggeration, but as grim fact. Human survival carved out of human death. Here's a chilling detail. Slaves weren't chained together only for control. The Mongols sometimes tied them in groups of 10 or 20. If one faltered, the weight of the rope dragged down the rest. Suddenly, survival wasn't just about your own endurance, it was about the endurance of strangers. Hate brewed, despair festered. Communities that once stood together fractured into bitter silence. The Mongols didn't just march bodies, they marched broken souls. But why? Why waste so many lives in transit? Because the Mongols calculated cruelty as carefully as they calculated battle formations. Each forced march was a mobile sieve, stripping away weakness and forging terror. Survivors arrived too exhausted to resist. Entire populations dwindled en route, leaving fewer mouths to feed, fewer rebels to fear, and for the Mongols, the trails of corpses served as propaganda. Villages ahead of the march would see skeletons, half-eaten bodies, frozen children, and surrender without a fight. European envoys noticed this too. Friar Giovanni da Pien del Carpine, who traveled through Mongol lands in the 1242, wrote about the lines of dead along the roads, corpses left unburied, bleaching in the sun or stiff in the frost. To him, it wasn't just evidence of cruelty. It was evidence of control. An empire that could treat thousands of lives as disposable had no limits to its power. And here's the final cruelty. For many captives, death on the march was liberation. Some threw themselves into rivers, hoping drowning would be faster than starvation. Others provoked guards deliberately, begging for a quick spear thrust rather than another day of stumbling under the lash. Parents smothered their infants to spare them the slow agony of frost or hunger. These were not isolated tragedies. They were daily realities, repeated across every steppe, every desert, every mountain pass. The Mongols crossed, so when you imagine the Mongol army on the move, don't just picture warriors galloping under banners, arrows glinting in the sunday. Picture the shadows trailing behind them, endless columns of slaves staggering through dust and snow, bodies collapsing by the roadside, rivers choked with the drowned, trails marked by bones gnawed clean by wolves. This was Chapter 8 of the Mongol Nightmare. Forced marches across the steppe. Not just relocation, not just movement, but deliberate attrition, death by distance, by exhaustion, by despair. An empire built not only by speed of horsemen, but by the slow, grinding death of those dragged in their wake. In the Mongol camps, survival didn't mean safety. Even if you weren't slaughtered in a massacre, even if you survived the forced march, even if you weren't eaten in times of famine, your body still wasn't your own. Because the Mongols had a system for control that went far beyond chains, branding, and mutilation. To them, captives weren't people. They were property, and property needed marks. Branding wasn't new in history. Slaves in Rome, Greece, and even later in the Islamic caliphates bore their owners' marks. But the Mongols took it to another level. Captives were seared with hot irons, the smoke rising as flesh burned, the mark announcing to all that this body belonged to the horde. It might be a simple slash, a circle, or a character scorched into the arm, chest, or face. Sometimes they were branded on the forehead, a living billboard of ownership. Persian chroniclers described the process in brutal detail. Slaves lined up, their clothes torn off, irons pulled from the fire glowing red. One by one, they were pressed against the skin until the hiss filled the air and the smell of charred flesh spread across the camp. Screams rang out. Some fainted. Guards laughed. To the Mongols, this wasn't cruelty, it was bookkeeping. Branding marked the difference between those who might be useful tomorrow and those destined for disposal. But branding was only the beginning. Mutilation was just as common, and often more horrific. Captives suspected of disobedience were maimed to prevent escape or rebellion. Noses sliced off, ears hacked away, tendons severed, fingers chopped. In one account, men were blinded so they could never guide armies or escape into the steppe. Women's ears or noses were cut as punishment for resistance. These weren't random acts. They were calculated mutilations, each scar a reminder of Mongol dominance. Here's what most people don't realize. Mutilation was also a form of public theater. A single slave caught stealing grain might have his hand cut off in front of hundreds of captives. The stump was then smeared with ash to stop the bleeding. He was thrown back into the camp as a living warning. He wouldn't live long, but he didn't need to. His mutilated body spoke louder than any guard's whip. And it wasn't only punishment. Sometimes mutilation was done for amusement. Chroniclers tell of Mongol warriors betting over how long a man could survive with his nose or lips cut away, or forcing captives to stagger through camp with ears hacked off, blood dripping down their shoulders, while laughter echoed around them. The mutilation wasn't about crime. It was about dominance and entertainment, another form of the sadistic games that defined Mongol slave life. One chilling account from Russian chronicles during the invasion of 1237 describes groups of captives mutilated systematically. Their noses and ears were cut, and they were released back to their villages as human warnings. Imagine the horror. Seeing your father return, mutilated, unable to speak clearly, a walking corpse sent by the Mongols to tell you resistance was useless. No letter, no envoy could deliver such terror more effectively than the mutilated bodies of your own people. Mutilation also had a practical side. Captives branded or disfigured couldn't escape easily. A man with a burn mark on his face couldn't hide in another village. A woman with her ears cut off carried the stigma of slavery everywhere. These wounds were permanent shackles, binding victims long after the Mongol guards were gone. Even if someone escaped, their scars betrayed them instantly. There was no going back. But mutilation could be grotesquely creative. Some sources describe captives forced to watch, as others had tendons cut in their legs, leaving them permanently crippled. They weren't killed, they were kept alive, crawling through the camp, reminders of what awaited those who defied orders. Others had tongues cut to silence them, ensuring they could no longer spread defiance. Each mutilation was a tool in the Mongols' arsenal of psychological control. Let me tell you about one infamous event at Herat in 1222. After the city rebelled against Mongol control, captives were rounded up. Thousands were executed, but among those spared, many were deliberately mutilated. Chroniclers record men with ears piled into heaps, noses discarded like scraps. Survivors were sent staggering back into the city to spread despair. The message was unmistakable: submit or watch your neighbors turned into grotesque parodies of themselves. Even outside the war zones, branding and mutilation remained routine in Karakorum and other Mongol centers. Slaves captured from China or Persia bore scars for life. Archaeological remains confirm this. Skulls with deliberate carvings, bones showing amputations done crudely with blades, faces that had been slashed deliberately. These weren't accidents. They were deliberate acts of mutilation committed in the shadow of the Mongol elite's palaces. And here's the cruel irony. For some captives, mutilation was survival. A mutilated man might not be sent to the front lines as cannon fodder. He might be left alive in the camp, too broken to escape, but alive nonetheless. Some deliberately injured themselves, slicing hands or fingers in the hope that disability would spare them from the next march or massacre. For a few, it worked. For most, it only guaranteed a slower, more humiliating death. European observers noticed this too. Friar William of Rubruck wrote of slaves marked like cattle, with burns and with scars, so that no man could mistake them. He was horrified not just by the cruelty, but by the scale. Entire populations reduced to branded, mutilated shells of humanity. So when we think of Mongol brutality, it's easy to focus on massacres and battles. But branding and mutilation were quieter tools of empire's slow violence carved into skin, bones, and memories. They didn't just kill the body, they killed dignity, identity, hope. A mutilated slave was more than a laborer. He was a walking message, a scarred reminder that the Mongols owned not only the land, but the flesh of everyone who lived on it. This was chapter 9 of the Mongol Nightmare. Branding and mutilation, where skin became parchment for power, where scars became shackles, and where the human body itself was turned into a billboard for Mongol terror. Throughout history, conquerors have looted gold, silver, jewels, and land. The Mongols looted all those things too, but they also treated something else as a form of wealth: women. In their camps, women weren't just victims of conquest. They were currency objects of trade, payment, and negotiation. Their bodies passed from hand to hand as casually as horses or saddles. When the city fell, the Mongols divided spoils. Horses went one way, weapons another, gold to the officers, and women to the rank and file. But here's the crucial detail. Women weren't just taken for pleasure. They became part of the economy of the camp. A woman might be traded for a bow, a sheep, or even a single flask of kumis, the fermented mare's milk that sustained Mongol warriors. Chroniclers from Persia and China both mention this grim commerce woman's worth reduced to barter, their lives converted into tokens of exchange. Persian historian Juvayni describes scenes after the sack of Nishapur. Women corralled into groups, their ages and appearances judged, their fates decided not by family ties or personal dignity, but by how many men wanted them. Some were taken by officers as concubines, others were distributed to soldiers, and those considered less desirable, they became camp currency, traded and passed along, each transaction stripping away what little humanity remained. Here's what most people don't realize. This wasn't random chaos after battle. It was structured. The Mongols had a system for distributing women. First, officers claimed noble women and young girls of high value. Then, warriors took their pick from the commoners. Finally, whatever remained became communal property, women who might be used collectively or traded in the markets that sprung up around Mongol encampments. To the captors, this wasn't exploitation. It was administration. To the captives, it was hell. One account from Chinese sources during the Jin dynasty's fall describes women lined up in front of warriors, their value debated out loud, too old worth a sheep, young, strong worth a bow, pretty worth a horse. The women stood silent, knowing their lives had been converted into price tags. Mothers clutched daughters, begging in vain to be taken together. Often, they were separated, parceled out like goods on a shelf. And here's the part that will make your stomach turn. Women weren't just exchanged for goods, they were used as rewards. A warrior who distinguished himself in battle might be given extra captives, like bonuses. Commanders might grant women as favors to loyal followers. There were also punishments offered to men in exchange for committing executions or other acts of cruelty. In some cases, women were used as stakes in gambling games, their futures decided by the roll of dice or the outcome of a wrestling match. Russian chronicles tell of women in conquered towns passed from one Mongol to another, sometimes 5 or 6 times in a single week. Their names forgotten, their identities erased, they became little more than that woman who was traded for a horse. Survivors recalled being treated like coins, counted, exchanged, spent. The constant transfers left them disoriented, broken, unable even to remember which man had last called himself their master. And the cruelty didn't stop with trade. Some women were deliberately humiliated in transactions. Men would boast of acquiring a woman for less than the cost of a dog or a piece of cloth. Others bragged about trading the same woman multiple times as if she were nothing but a piece of livestock increasing in value with circulation. This wasn't only about possession, it was about reducing women to objects so thoroughly that their very humanity disappeared. Let me give you one specific case. In the aftermath of the fall of Urgench, a major Khwarezmian city, chroniclers describe a market where women were displayed openly. Soldiers shouted offers, haggled over their worth, sometimes fighting each other over a desirable captive. Meanwhile, women who fetched no interest were beaten, raped, or killed on the spot. Imagine standing in that market, your body inspected like a piece of cloth, while your life hung on whether someone considered you worth a bowstring. Even noble women weren't safe. The wives and daughters of rulers, generals, and wealthy merchants were sometimes spared the market, but only to be sent into the harems of Mongol princes. Even there, they weren't free. They were political tokens, symbols of submission, reminders that even the highest-born woman of a fallen city could be reduced to property in the hands of her conquerors. Archaeological evidence support this economy of exploitation. At sites of Mongol encampments in Central Asia, researchers have found women's ornaments, necklaces, bracelets discarded in trash pits, broken and scattered. These weren't heirlooms kept with care. They were items stripped from women, traded, and thrown away once their value was spent. The objects survived, the women often did not. Here's the psychological cruelty. Women weren't just enslaved physically. They were made to feel their worth in the cruelest terms. A horse, a bow, a sheep. Imagine being told that your body was equivalent to livestock. Imagine watching your sister or mother bartered away for a few scraps of food. The Mongols turned women into currency, but not just for economic convenience. It was a weapon to crush morale, to show entire populations that their daughters, wives, and mothers could be reduced to coins in a savage economy. And for the children born of the system, many never knew their fathers, passed as their mothers were from man to man. Some grew up as slaves themselves, raised in the same camps where their mothers had been traded. Others were killed at birth, too many mouths to feed, too much trouble to raise. Life began and ended under the shadow of barter. So when we think about the wealth of the Mongol Empire, its treasure caravans, its silk, its gold, we must also remember the human economy that fueled it. For the Mongols, women weren't just captives. They were commodities. They were poker chips in games of power, bargaining tools in diplomacy, bribes for loyalty, punishments for disobedience. This was chapter 10 of the Mongol nightmare. Women as camp currency, where a human life could be reduced to the price of a sheep, where dignity was traded for liquor, where mothers and daughters became units of exchange in an empire built not just on conquest, but on commodification of the human body. Death in the Mongol camps wasn't just punishment, it was performance. Executions weren't hidden away behind walls or carried out swiftly in silence. They were staged, prolonged, and savored as a form of entertainment. For the Mongols, killing wasn't merely about eliminating enemies. It was about turning cruelty into spectacle, a grim theater where the audience cheered, laughed, and learned the cost of defiance. In most societies, executions had a ritual purpose: to enforce law, to warn others, to appease gods. In the Mongol camps, they became sport. Captives accused of crimes real or imagined were killed not efficiently, but creatively. And more often than not, these killings weren't about justice at all. They were about amusement. One method was the archery execution. Captives were tied to posts or made to stand in open fields, while Mongol warriors took turns firing arrows. But here's the detail. They weren't aiming for the heart or the head. They aimed for limbs, stomach, groin places that wouldn't kill instantly. The goal was to prolong the agony, to show off skill. Some chroniclers describe contests. Who could lodge the most arrows without killing? Who could pin a man's ears or hands to a stake without ending his life? The condemned became a target dummy, his body slowly shredded while the crowd applauded. Persian historian Juvayni tells us of executions staged after the fall of Nishapur. Captives were lined up, stripped, and used for bow practice. The Mongols laughed as arrows thudded into flesh, boasting about the quality of their shots. Some men died quickly. Others bled out for hours, collapsing into heaps of bodies while guards kicked at them to see if they still twitched. For the Mongols, this wasn't just cruelty. It was training, honing skills for the next battle under the guise of entertainment. Another form of sport execution was trampling. Captives were thrown into open spaces, then herds of horses driven over them. Some were crushed instantly, bones snapping under hoofs. Others were maimed, left screaming, while more horses thundered past. Chroniclers record Mongol soldiers laughing, betting on how many stomps a man could survive. Women and children weren't spared. Some were forced to lie down, arms spread, while the spectacle unfolded to the roars of soldiers. But the Mongols didn't stop with archery and trampling. They experimented. Chinese sources record boiling alive as a form of punishment. Victims were thrown into cauldrons of water or oil, their screams echoing through camp while warriors drank and feasted. Other accounts mention men buried up to their necks and left for dogs to tear apart, their comrades forced to watch. These weren't hidden atrocities, they were open-air theaters of terror. Russian chronicles add another gruesome detail. During the invasion of the principalities, Mongol officers sometimes staged mock trials. Captives were accused of disobedience, dragged before a crowd, then executed in creative ways. Decapitated with blunt swords, flayed alive, or strangled slowly with bowstrings. The theatrics mattered more than the death itself. Soldiers cheered at every scream, every spurt of blood. The condemned weren't criminals. They were actors in a play they hadn't auditioned for. Here's what most people don't realize. These executions weren't only for soldiers' amusement. They were lessons for the other slaves. Imagine being forced to stand in rows, watching your friend or family member shot with arrows one by one, knowing you could be next. The Mongols understood that fear is strongest when it's shared. By turning death into a show, they made sure no captive forgot who held the power. One of the most infamous spectacles comes from the siege of Herat in 1222. After the city's rebellion, thousands of captives were paraded into an open field. Groups were separated out for execution. But instead of killing them quickly, the Mongols played with them. Some were tied together in pairs and forced to run while mounted archers chased them down. Others were stripped and mutilated before the crowd. The executions lasted for days. Survivors remember the sound of laughter ringing louder than the victims' screams. And it wasn't just men. Women, too, were executed for sport. Some were forced to dance naked before being cut down. Others were mocked, jeered, and killed in humiliating ways, strangled with their own hair, drowned in pits of filth, or shot as they tried desperately to flee. The cruelty was as much about psychological humiliation as physical pain. European envoys noticed this as well. Friar Giovanni da Pien del Carpin described executions carried out not in justice but for mirth, with Mongol warriors delighting in the death cries of men as in music. To him, it was almost incomprehensible death as comedy, agony as laughter. But to the Mongols, it was normal. Archaeological evidence backs this horror. Excavations at sites like Samarkand and Merv have uncovered mass graves filled with bodies bearing arrow wounds in unusual places, legs, arms, pelvises. These weren't battle injuries. They were deliberate shots to prolong suffering, to turn execution into performance. The skeletons themselves tell the story of men and women used as props in the theater of death. The cruel genius here is repetition. Executions for sport weren't rare spectacles. They were regular, part of the rhythm of camp life. A slave who faltered in labor might be executed at sunset to entertain bored soldiers. A woman who resisted assault might be killed publicly the next morning. These weren't extraordinary punishments. They were everyday events. And imagine the psychological weight. To live in a camp where any moment could turn into a stage for death, where laughter accompanied agony, where every execution was both warning and entertainment. Death ceased to be a singular terror. It became a daily backdrop, a drumbeat of cruelty that eroded every shred of hope. So when we speak of the Mongol terror, we must remember it wasn't only about battles won or cities destroyed. It was about the campfires where men cheered as captives were shot like targets. It was about the open fields where horses trampled screaming bodies. It was about the execution pits where laughter drowned out prayer. This was chapter 11 of the Mongol nightmare, executions for sport, where death wasn't justice, wasn't necessity, but amusement, where cruelty wasn't hidden, but celebrated, and where every scream reminded the living that they, too, were just one step away from becoming the evening's entertainment. Of all the horrors the Mongols inflicted, perhaps none cut deeper than what they did to children. To kill a man is one thing, to humiliate a woman, another. But to take the youngest, the innocent, the helpless, and twist them into tools of fear, that was the true cruelty of the camps. Because for the Mongols, children weren't sacred. They were malleable clay, easily broken, easily reshaped, and above all, expendable. When cities fell, the fate of children was immediate and brutal. Some were killed outright, thrown into pits, their tiny bodies discarded like rubbish. Chroniclers from Persia and Khwarezm write of heaps of children slaughtered so their cries would not slow the massacres. At Nishapur, after the infamous slaughter of 1,221, children were gathered into groups and executed alongside their families. The Mongols, laughing as infants, were tossed into the air and caught on spear tips. These acts weren't hidden. They were deliberate, calculated to shatter the survivors who watched. But not every child was killed. Some were taken, enslaved, and broken slowly. Those children became living tools in the Mongol camps. They carried water, gathered dung for fuel, herded animals, and fetched supplies. And because they were young, their capacity for endurance was tested cruelly. Beatings were constant. Whips left marks on backs still soft with baby fat. The Mongols believed that if a child could survive this treatment, he would grow into a useful servant, or better yet, a soldier. If not, he was discarded like trash. Here's what most people don't realize. Children weren't just slaves. They were entertainment. Mongol warriors sometimes staged games where children were forced to run in circles, while mounted riders tried to lasso them like calves. Others were made to crawl through mud, while soldiers prodded them with spears. To the Mongols, it was laughter. To the children, It was terror written into the earliest memories of their lives. One Persian chronicler describes a particularly horrific game. Captured boys were tied together in groups of 10 and forced to fight each other with sticks. The victors were allowed to live another day. The losers were executed immediately, sometimes by the very boys they had just fought, forced to deliver the killing blows. Imagine being 12 years old, made to beat your friend to death with a stick while Mongol warriors laughed and applauded. That wasn't just cruelty. That was psychological annihilation. And then there were the children used as human shields. We saw this in chapter 1 with adults, but children were especially effective in this role. Defenders hesitated when they saw children driven toward the walls, their small bodies chained together, their cries echoing under the arrows. Parents on the walls lowered their bows. Warriors faltered. And in that hesitation, the Mongols advanced. Children were weapons, their innocence twisted into a tool of war. Russian chronicles describe children taken on forced marches, their feet bleeding on frozen ground. Some collapsed, begging for rest. Guards beat them until they rose again or left them for wolves. Mothers who tried to carry their children often stumbled under the weight, punished with lashes until they dropped both child and hope. Along the trails of Mongol conquest, the ground was littered not only with corpses of men, but with the tiny bodies of children who never reached the next camp. And yet, some children survived. But survival meant transformation. The Mongols practiced what we would now call forced assimilation. Boys were sometimes taken into camps and trained as soldiers. They were stripped of names, taught Mongol words, drilled in Mongol discipline. By adolescence, they no longer remembered their parents' language or customs. They became part of the war machine that had destroyed their families. Imagine a child taken from Persia at 8 years old, raised in Karakoram, and by 16 riding with the horde to slaughter his own people. That wasn't survival. That was the breaking of identity itself. Women and girls, too, suffered a different fate. Many were absorbed into the breeding pits described earlier. Others were used as camp servants, traded among warriors like currency. Their childhood ended in the moment of capture, replaced by a lifetime of servitude. Some were as young as 10 or 11, their bodies not even developed. Yet they were forced into sexual slavery. The trauma was both physical and psychological. A lifetime of wounds carved into the earliest stages of life. European envoys who witnessed Mongol practices wrote with horror about the treatment of children. Friar Giovanni da Pien del Carpin recorded that Mongols regarded the children of their captives as beasts, fit only for labor or disposal. William of Rubruck described children so emaciated that their bones jutted through their skin, their voices little more than whispers. For him, the cruelty wasn't just the death, it was the casualness, the indifference of men who saw no difference between breaking a stick and breaking a child. Archaeological evidence bears this out. Graves near Mongol massacre sites contain the remains of children with trauma to the skulls and spines, blows from blunt instruments, stabs from blades. Others show malnutrition, growth, stunted by starvation, bones marked with signs of chronic stress. These weren't isolated tragedies. They were systemic, repeated across the breadth of an empire. But perhaps the cruelest fate wasn't death or slavery. It was being forced to witness. Children were sometimes spared during massacres, not out of mercy, but out of calculation. They were made to watch their families slaughtered, their homes burned, their lives erased. Then they were left alive, scarred forever, to carry the message of Mongol terror to the next village. Survivors remember this for generations. The child who returned broken, the empty eyes that carry the memory of screams. That was psychological warfare written onto the smallest witnesses. So, when we think of Mongol conquest, we often picture grand battles, sweeping strategies, maps covered in arrows. But the true legacy is smaller, quieter, and more haunting. It's in the bones of children who never grew tall, in the broken spirits of boys turned into soldiers, in the screams of girls sold like cattle. This was chapter 12 of the Mongol Nightmare, the breaking of children, where innocence wasn't spared, where play became torture, where childhood itself was twisted into a weapon of empire. Death was only one fate. The other was survival without childhood at all. Hunger, is one of history's cruelest weapons. When food runs out, when bellies ache and ribs show through skin, the line between civilization and savagery dissolves. And in the Mongol slave camps, that line was crossed more than once. Because famine wasn't rare, it was constant. Armies moved quickly, stripping land bare. Captives, who were always fed last, often starved. And when starvation dug its claws deep enough, the camps descended into horrors most of us can barely imagine. Cannibalism. Let's make something clear. The Mongols themselves were masters of surviving scarcity. They drank horse blood, fermented mare's milk, and gnawed dried meat tough as leather. But their slaves? They had no herds, no stores, no supplies. They were expendables, forced to live on scraps thrown their way, bones with no meat, grain husks, or nothing at all. Weeks of this turned men and women into skeletons, their eyes sunken, their breath foul. And then came the breaking point. Persian chroniclers hint at it cautiously, their words heavy with disgust. During long campaigns, when rations ran dry, slaves sometimes turned on each other. The weak were killed and eaten by the desperate. Sometimes this happened in secret, at night in the corners of camps. Other times it was orchestrated by the Mongols themselves. A soldier might toss a half-dead captive into a pit of starving slaves and watch as hunger did the rest. It wasn't only cruelty, it was entertainment. One account, preserved by Arab historians of the Khwarezmian campaigns, describes slaves reduced to boiling strips of human flesh, cut from corpses left unburied. The smell of it burnt, greasy, nauseating, clung to the camp. Children gnawed on bones not knowing they belonged to their neighbors. Mothers wept as they chewed, knowing the act was both salvation and damnation. Imagine the silence afterward. No prayers, no songs, just the sound of chewing, the shame unspoken but heavy as stone. Here's what most people don't realize. The Mongols weaponized starvation deliberately. They gave just enough food to keep slaves alive, but too little to keep them sane. When captives crossed into cannibalism, they broke in spirit. They saw themselves not as victims, but as beasts. That transformation was irreversible. No one who ate human flesh in desperation could ever look at themselves the same again. The Mongols knew this, and they encouraged it. Chinese sources from the siege of Kaifeng in the 1232 record that Mongol guards sometimes withheld food from slaves intentionally, then provided them with corpses of executed captives. Eat or die, they were told. Many resisted at first, fainting from hunger. But when days passed with no grain, most gave in. Some chroniclers speak of mothers forced to cook the flesh of their own dead children to keep their other children alive. The cruelty was absolute. Even survival became torment. And this horror wasn't confined to Asia. Russian chronicles tell of slaves during the winter campaigns of 1237, 1240 feeding on bodies left frozen along the road. Snow covered the corpses, but hunger uncovered them again. The frost preserved the flesh. Desperate captives cut strips and boiled them in melted snow. Survivors wrote later that the meat tasted of despair more than of salt. Imagine that memory seared into you, the taste of your own kind, the sound of your own heart breaking. The Mongols themselves sometimes joked about it. Friar Giovanni Dapien del Carpin, who traveled into Mongol lands in the 1242, reported hearing soldiers laugh about slaves, eating each other like wolves. The casualness is what chills the blood. For the Mongols, it wasn't scandal, it was proof of dominance. Even hunger is ours, they seem to say. And here's the darkest twist. Cannibalism sometimes wasn't born of desperation, but of design. Chroniclers hint at feasts where Mongols forced captives to cook and eat human flesh in front of each other. Refusal meant death. Compliance meant living with the memory forever. One Arab historian describes captives forced to eat their relatives, their faces smeared with grease and tears, while warriors mocked them. That wasn't hunger. That was humiliation made edible. Archaeological evidence supports these grim tales. At excavation sites near old Mongol encampments in Central Asia, human bones have been found with cut marks identical to those left on butchered livestock, clean slices on femurs, skulls split open for marrow. These aren't battle wounds. They're signs of systematic butchery. The flesh wasn't wasted. It was consumed. What does this tell us? That in the Mongol camps, even death wasn't the end. Your body might not rest in a grave or a pyre. It might feed your fellow captives. It might become soup in a pot, marrow sucked from your bones by the same people who once stood beside you in chains. Death wasn't release. It was recycling. And think of the survivors, the ones who ate. They carry that shame for the rest of their lives. Some were released later, sent back to spread tales of Mongol terror. What more terrifying story could you tell your neighbors than, I was made to eat my own people? That's not just atrocity. That's psychological warfare etched into the deepest taboos of humanity. So when we speak of Mongol brutality, we mustn't forget the hunger, the gnawing emptiness that drove slaves to cross lines no human should cross. Massacres kill the body, but famine and the cannibal feast it spawned kill the soul. This was chapter 13 of the Mongol Nightmare, Cannibal Feast of Desperation, where hunger became a weapon, where flesh became currency, and where survival itself was poisoned by the taste of human despair. For many cultures, death is sacred. Even in the midst of war, even among enemies, the dead are given some measure of respect, buried, burned, laid to rest in rites that acknowledge their humanity. But in the Mongol camps, the dead didn't find peace. Their bodies were not honored, but desecrated. Corpses became tools, warnings, even objects of mockery. Death was no escape from Mongol cruelty. It was simply another stage for humiliation. After massacres, Mongols often left bodies unburied. Persian chroniclers like Juvayni describe cities where corpses lay for weeks, swelling in the sun, picked apart by dogs and vultures. The stench carried for miles. But this wasn't neglect. It was deliberate. Leaving corpses to rot wasn't laziness, it was terror. Survivors saw the bodies of their loved ones consumed by animals, their memory degraded. The message was clear. The Mongols not only destroyed life, they stripped away dignity in death. Sometimes corpses were turned into physical barricades. At sieges, Mongols piled bodies into ditches to fill moats, or stacked them against city walls to build ramps. Imagine climbing over the mangled remains of neighbors, hearing bones crack under your feet as you carried a ladder to the walls. The defenders saw not just the Mongols advancing, but their own dead weaponized against them. Bodies became building materials, war tools in an empire where nothing went to waste. One Persian account describes a particularly horrific scene at the fall of Kurganj. Thousands of corpses were flung into the Oxus River. Some floated, others sank, clogging the banks with pale limbs and bloated faces. The river turned black with decay, and yet Mongol soldiers laughed as they watched bodies bob past. To them, the dead were props in a performance, reminders of their power. To survivors, it was unbearable. Desecration water turned into a graveyard, memory poisoned with the smell of rot. And it wasn't only about disposal. Sometimes, corpses were mutilated post-mortem for amusement. Ears and noses hacked off to create grotesque piles, bodies arranged in obscene poses, skulls turned into drinking cups. Chroniclers speak of warriors playing games with severed heads, kicking them like balls across the dirt. In one infamous case, recorded by Arab sources, Mongol soldiers mounted corpses upright, propping them like puppets, forcing slaves to bow before the mockery of their dead kin. Here's what most people don't realize. The Mongols understood the spiritual devastation of desecration. In Islamic lands, the body must be buried swiftly and with dignity. In Christian and Russian Orthodox lands, funerals were sacred rituals. In China, honoring ancestors through burial rites was foundational to society. By desecrating bodies, the Mongols weren't just insulting individuals. They were tearing at the very fabric of culture, breaking communities by denying them closure. And it wasn't limited to enemies. Even among their own slaves, death did not guarantee rest. Captives who collapsed from exhaustion were often left where they fell, their corpses trampled by carts and horses. Others were burned in trash fires alongside animal carcasses and dung. Their bones cracked, their ashes mixed with refuse, their memory erased. Death was treated no differently than waste disposal. But the desecration also served psychological warfare. Survivors were sometimes forced to handle corpses, to drag their relatives into pits, to watch their loved ones defiled. One chronicler describes a father made to bury his daughter alive among the dead. Another tells of women ordered to strip the bodies of men before burning them, their tears mocked as laughter echoed around them. The cruelty wasn't in the killing alone, it was in forcing the living to desecrate the dead with their own hands. Archaeology confirms the pattern. At sites of Mongol sieges, mass graves show hurried, careless disposal. Bodies tossed together in heaps, limbs twisted, skulls cracked. Some skeletons bear signs of post-mortem mutilation, cut marks on bones that had no place in combat, skulls split deliberately, ribs pried apart. These aren't battle wounds. They're desecration, inflicted after death as a form of message and mockery. One of the most infamous acts of desecration came during the Mongol campaign against the Rus. Chronicles describe the city of Kozelsk, where after weeks of resistance, the Mongols massacred nearly all inhabitants. Bodies were left unburied, rotting in the spring thaw. Survivors described the land as a sea of corpses, the ground so thick with death that one could not walk without stepping on bodies. Wolves and crows feasted, and the Mongols laughed, calling Kozelsk the evil city, punished not only in life, but in the obliteration of its dead. And yet, the desecration wasn't only about terrorizing populations. It was about erasing memory. Monuments could be rebuilt, houses reconstructed, but when corpses were defiled, when skulls were piled into pyramids or thrown into rivers, families could not honor their dead. There were no graves to visit, no rituals to perform, no names to remember. The Mongols understood that destroying the dignity of the dead meant destroying the continuity of culture itself. So when we imagine Mongol conquest, don't think only of the battles, the thunder of hooves, the clash of swords. Think of the silence after the fields strewn with rotting bodies, the rivers choked with the dead, the laughter of soldiers playing with severed heads. Think of the survivors who could not mourn, who could not bury, who lived with the image of desecration burned into their memories. This was chapter 14 of the Mongol Nightmare, desecration of the dead, where even death gave no release, where bodies became tools of terror, and where the final dignity of humanity, the right to rest, was stripped away as surely as life itself. The Mongols built their empire not only with horses, arrows, and cunning strategy, but with silence, the silence left after screams. Because once the massacres ended, once the fires cooled, once the camps moved on, what remained wasn't just ruins. It was emptiness. The final cruelty of the Mongols wasn't slaughter. It was absence. Chroniclers describe this silence with haunting clarity. After the sack of Nishapur, Juvayni wrote that dogs and wolves made their lairs where men had dwelt, and no cock crowed, nor dog barked, nor beacon burned. Entire neighborhoods reduced to dust, their streets empty of voices, their wells choked with corpses. Survivors, if any, moved like shadows, too few to rebuild, too broken to speak. That silence was the Mongols' greatest weapon. It echoed louder than their armies. Here's what most people don't realize. Silence was deliberate. The Mongols didn't always kill everyone. Sometimes they left a handful alive, crippled, mutilated, or traumatized so they could carry the memory. A village where no one survived told no story, but a village where one broken child returned, eyes wide, words trembling, spread terror for miles. Silence was punctuated with whispers of fear, carried across frontiers faster than cavalry. Russian chronicles recall the aftermath of Ryazan's fall in 1237. There was no cry of infant, no song of maiden, no laughter of youth, only the wind in the ashes. Survivors who entered days later describe streets littered with bones, houses collapsed, the smell of smoke and rot lingering like a curse. But the worst part was the silence, no prayers, no markets, no music. Life had been extracted as thoroughly as if the city had never existed, and silence lingered in the camps too. After nights of laughter, of executions as sport, of humiliations and screams, the dawn often felt eerily quiet. Captives too exhausted to speak, too broken to cry, too terrified to hope. Chroniclers note this strange hush, an entire population alive but voiceless, stripped of the will to express even despair. That silence wasn't peace. It was submission carved into the human soul. Sometimes silence came from empty land. The Mongols practiced the policy of scorched earth, driving entire populations from fertile valleys, leaving behind ghost landscapes, wells poisoned, fields burned, corpses unburied. Travelers passing through months later found nothing but ruins and the silence of desolation. Imagine walking for days across plains where not a single human voice breaks the air, only crows circling above. That wasn't an accident. That was empire by silence. And silence carried across generations. In some places, entire cultures disappeared. Languages went extinct. Songs unremembered. Traditions severed. The Mongols didn't just silence individuals. They silenced histories. Archaeologists today uncover layers of ash where once stood bustling cities, their written records lost, their libraries burned. The silence of the past still grips us, because what should have been preserved was obliterated. But here's the cruel irony. Silence itself became the loudest memory. Chroniclers from Persia, Russia, and China all struggled to describe what it meant to enter a city after the Mongols had left. They wrote of silence as if it were a physical presence pressing down on the chest, suffocating, unbearable. A silence of the grave, one Persian poet called it, where the earth itself refuses to speak. That silence wasn't emptiness. It was filled with the echoes of screams, now stilled. Think of the psychological impact. Survivors lived in fear not just of Mongol return, but of silence itself. A quiet street, an empty horizon, a hush before dawn, any of these could trigger terror. In this way, the Mongols left behind not only ruins but trauma encoded into sound, or rather, the lack of it. Even centuries later, folktales across Central Asia and Russia warn of silent fields where nothing grows, where the wind itself is haunted. European envoys like William of Rubruck noted it too. Traveling through Mongol lands, he remarked on empty towns and villages, silent and bare, where none dwell. To him, the silence was more shocking than battle. Armies can be seen, heard, confronted. Silence is intangible, inescapable, suffocating. It was victory turned into atmosphere. And that, perhaps, was the final brilliance and the final horror of the Mongols. They didn't just win wars, they controlled memory. By leaving silence where there had once been life, they ensured their terror outlived their presence. People submitted not only because of swords and arrows, but because silence told them resistance was futile. You can argue with propaganda. You can fight against armies. But what do you do against emptiness? Against silence? So when we recount the Mongol conquests, don't think only of the roaring cavalry charges or the thunder of hooves. Think of what came after the long, heavy quiet that settled over cities and countrysides. The silence that made survivors tremble more than screams ever could. That silence was the truest legacy of the Mongols. This was chapter 15 of the Mongol Nightmare, the silence after the screams, where conquest ended not in sound but in absence, where the final weapon wasn't fire or steel but emptiness, and where the silence itself became eternal, carrying across generations as the most haunting echo of all.